The flashing lights hit my gate just as animal control stepped out with tranquilizers ready. The HOA president stood behind them, arms crossed, telling everyone a dangerous illegal tiger was loose in the neighborhood. Phones were recording. Neighbors were panicking. And with one call to 911, she just triggered something she couldn't take back. What she didn't know was that every accusation was documented, every lie time-stamped. That call didn't just put my property at risk. It activated permits, licenses, and a legal chain reaction that reached far beyond our HOA. That should have ended it, but it didn't. Because instead of backing down, she doubled down. And that decision cost her everything. Before we jump into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever had a crazy HOA moment, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. The problem wasn't new by the time the police lights hit my gate. It had already been building, quietly, officially, and with paperwork. I'd been living on that property for years, long enough to know how the HOA worked. Clean lawns, quiet streets, the kind of place where people waved but also watched. I followed the rules because it was easier that way. My days were predictable. Early mornings, controlled routines, inspections scheduled weeks in advance. Nothing chaotic. Nothing reckless. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. What the HOA saw was land. Fencing. Security cameras. Deliveries that didn't fit their idea of normal. What they didn't see, or didn't bother to understand, was that everything on my property existed for a reason. Permitted. Inspected. But I assumed that mattered. The first sign it didn't came in the form of an email marked urgent. It wasn't aggressive. Not yet. It referenced unusual animal activity and concerns raised by residents. No accusations. Just a reminder that the HOA reserved the right to investigate anything that posed a community risk. At the time, it felt procedural, almost harmless. That should have been my warning. Life continued in short, fragile stretches of normal. I fed my animals, checked enclosures, filed routine compliance reports. Every task was deliberate, controlled, legal. I'd built my operation to survive scrutiny from state agencies, federal inspectors, and public safety officials. An HOA didn't even register as a threat. But then the drive-bys started. Unmarked cars slowing near my gate. Phones raised, lowered, raised again. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to suddenly had questions about zoning, about noise, about safety. None of it came to me directly. It all went upward, into HOA inboxes and complaint logs I couldn't see. A week later, the first notice arrived. It cited a violation of unauthorized exotic animal presence. No species listed. No inspection conducted. Just a fine and a deadline to resolve the issue. At the time, it seemed sloppy, amateur. I assumed it would be corrected as soon as someone competent looked at it. I didn't realize what that notice really meant. I responded calmly. Attached permits. State licenses. USDA documentation. Pages of approvals that had survived far harsher reviews than an HOA committee. I expected silence. Or maybe an apology. Instead, I got escalation. The HOA president took over personally. Suddenly, correspondence stopped being about rules and started being about authority. She referenced emergency powers. Claimed the board had an obligation to act before something tragic happened. Still no inspection. Still no request to verify facts. Just assumptions, dressed up as concern. Normal life shrank. 30 seconds of quiet feeding time, interrupted by a car idling too long outside the fence. A calm afternoon shattered by another final notice. Each moment of peace felt borrowed. Then came the warning letter. It stated that if the alleged animal was not removed immediately, the HOA would involve law enforcement and animal control to protect the community. The language was careful, but the intent wasn't. This wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about control. At the time, I thought logic would win. I thought permits would matter. I thought evidence would slow them down. I thought no one would be reckless enough to make a false emergency call over something they didn't understand. I was wrong. Because instead of verifying anything, the HOA president made a decision for me. A decision that turned paperwork into sirens. A decision that escalated a civil disagreement into a criminal-looking scene. And the notice taped to my gate the next morning made it clear. If I didn't comply immediately, they would act again, without warning, without review, and without caring who got caught in the fallout. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to stop. The warning on my gate should have slowed them down. Instead, it did the opposite. Within days, the HOA shifted from paperwork to pressure. The fines started arriving faster than I could respond. One for unverified animal activity. Another for security structures inconsistent with residential use. None of them referenced inspections. None acknowledged the documents I'd already sent. It felt less like enforcement and more like noise, constant, deliberate noise meant to wear me down. At first, I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself this was still civil. Still fixable. I paid one fine under protest, thinking it might buy time. That should have ended it, but it didn't. The payment was treated like an admission. Suddenly, the tone of the letters changed. Words like violation were replaced with non-compliance. Deadlines shrank. Penalties doubled. The HOA president stopped ceasing the board and started signing everything herself. It was subtle, but the message was clear. This was personal now. I started noticing neighbors behaving differently. People who used to nod now crossed the street. Someone left a printed article about exotic animal attacks in my mailbox. Another neighbor filed a complaint about roaring at night, even though my animals were quieter than most dogs in the area. I felt the pressure closing in from all sides. Then came the first inspection attempt. No notice. No appointment. Just a knock at my gate while I was in the middle of routine care. When I didn't open immediately, they marked it as denial of access. That single line turned into 3 new violations by the end of the week. I appealed. Calmly. Formally. I included timestamps, footage, and proof I'd been on the property the entire time. For a brief moment, it felt like I'd regained control. That was the mini resolution. 2 days later, I received a certified letter. It stated that due to repeated refusal to cooperate, the HOA was considering emergency action. The phrase stood out because it didn't belong there. Emergency. Over an animal they'd never seen, on property they'd never inspected. I remember sitting there, letter in hand, thinking this had crossed a line. Surely someone would step in. Surely this was where logic returned. Instead, the HOA president sent a community-wide email. She warned residents about a potentially dangerous situation being ignored by the homeowner. She framed it as concern, safety, responsibility. But the subtext was unmistakable. I was being labeled before anyone had verified a single fact. That email changed everything. Neighbors stopped being passive. Someone reported my security cameras as intimidating. Another complained about delivery trucks, even though they came during approved hours. Each complaint triggered another notice, another fine, another deadline. I felt boxed in. I contacted an attorney. Just a consultation. Nothing aggressive. He told me to keep documenting and not to assume the HOA would act rationally once fear entered the picture. That advice stuck with me. Because fear was spreading, and it wasn't mine. The HOA president started referencing liability exposure. She claimed the board could be personally sued if they didn't act. She pushed for immediate removal of the animal, without ever confirming what animal she was talking about. When I asked for a formal inspection with state officials present, she ignored the request. Instead, she issued an ultimatum. Comply voluntarily, or the HOA would coordinate with authorities. For a moment, I thought that meant mediation, or at least oversight. I didn't realize she meant force. The next few days felt like borrowed time. Normal routines continued in fragments. Feedings. Just reports. But every peaceful moment carried an edge. A car slowing too much. A neighbor watching from behind blinds. My phone buzzing with another notification from the HOA portal. Then the notice arrived that froze everything. It stated the HOA had voted, without my presence, to classify the situation as an imminent community threat. They authorized immediate action to neutralize it. Neutralize. That word didn't belong in any HOA document. I filed an emergency response. Sent it to every board member, every listed contact. Attached permits again. Highlighted expiration dates years into the future. I expected panic. Retraction. At least a pause. Instead, I got silence. For 24 hours, nothing happened. No emails. No letters. No cars slowing outside my gate. It was almost peaceful, and that terrified me. Because silence from an HOA isn't calm. It's preparation. The call came early the next morning. A neighbor, whispering, told me the HOA president had been asking questions about animal control procedures, about emergency dispatch, about response times. I told myself she wouldn't actually do it. She couldn't. That's when the first siren echoed down the street. I watched from my gate as police cars pulled up, followed by animal control trucks. The HOA president stood at the edge of my property, pointing, explaining, controlling the narrative in real time. For a split second, I thought this was the worst possible outcome. I was wrong. Because as the officers started asking questions, as paperwork came out and cameras started recording, the HOA president made a move that couldn't be undone. She insisted, loudly, that an illegal, dangerous tiger was loose and that immediate action was required. That was the moment everything locked into place. And as animal control reached for tranquilizers, I realized this had gone far beyond fines and notices. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was an accusation. And once that accusation was officially logged, there was no going back. The moment the accusation was spoken out loud, everything accelerated. Once illegal tiger was logged over the radio, the scene stopped being about HOA rules and started looking like a public safety incident. Officers repositioned. Animal control moved closer to my gate. Neighbors leaned out with phones raised, capturing a version of events that had already been poisoned before anyone checked a single fact. I felt the pressure immediately, not fear, but urgency. Because I knew something the HOA president didn't. And once the machinery of enforcement started moving, it was going to expose her far more than it exposed me. I asked for time. Not permission. Time to retrieve documents already filed with the state. Time to contact the agencies that had inspected my property repeatedly. For a brief second, the officers hesitated. They weren't convinced yet. They could feel the uncertainty in the air. That hesitation infuriated the HOA president. She pushed harder. She insisted the animal was a tiger, that it had escaped containment, that residents were in danger right now. She demanded immediate action. And in doing so, she crossed from reporting into directing. That was the turning point. Because once she positioned herself as the authority overriding procedure, the officers began documenting her behavior instead of just my property. Body cameras stayed on. Notes got longer. Questions shifted. I watched animal control pause when I handed over my license packet, not one page, but a binder. Federal permits. State registrations. Inspection certificates. Emergency response plans. Each document stamped, dated, and current. Nothing rushed. Nothing improvised. The energy changed. What I didn't realize then was how fast that shift would travel. A supervisor arrived. Then another. They walked the perimeter instead of rushing the gate. They reviewed enclosure specs instead of reaching for tranquilizers. Every minute that passed without action undermined the urgency the HOA president had created. She noticed it too. So she escalated again. She claimed the permits were forged. Claimed I was operating outside zoning. Claimed she had board authorization to seize the animal if authorities wouldn't act. It was reckless, emotional, and completely unsupported. That's when the first call went out, not to remove my animal, but to verify my credentials. I stood there, watching the person who had controlled months of my life lose control in real time. Her confidence didn't fade all at once. It cracked in sharp, uneven pieces. She argued with officers, interrupted supervisors, corrected professionals who didn't need correcting. And every correction was being recorded. Within an hour, the situation had inverted. The HOA president was no longer the source of information. She was the source of disruption. Officers asked her to step back. Animal control stopped advancing. Phones stayed up, but now they were pointed at her. Then came the confirmation. A call from the state office. Quiet. Professional. Final. My permits were valid. The animal was registered. The enclosure exceeded requirements. There was no violation. No emergency. No justification for the response that had been triggered. I thought that would end it. It didn't. Because instead of backing down, the HOA president made the mistake that sealed everything. She accused the officers of negligence. Threatened to report them. Claimed the HOA would pursue action independently if authorities failed their duty. That statement changed the entire posture of the scene. Once she declared intent to act outside the law, the officers shut it down. The call was over. The situation was resolved, officially, in my favor. And the reason it was resolved wasn't because I argued louder, but because she refused to stop talking. By the time the vehicles began leaving, the damage was already done. Not to me, to her. Neighbors had recorded everything. The accusations. The contradictions. The moment she insisted on force after being told there was no threat. What she thought was a show of authority became evidence of abuse. But the climax didn't end at the gate. It followed me into the following weeks. The HOA issued a statement claiming miscommunication. Then retracted it. Then issued another blaming outside agencies. Each version contradicted the last. Meanwhile, my attorney moved faster than they expected. Requests went out. Records were demanded. Emails, meeting minutes, complaint logs. And once those documents surfaced, the pattern became impossible to deny. Targeting. Escalation. Fabrication of urgency. The HOA president's confidence collapsed completely when she was formally notified that her 911 call was under review, not as a concerned report, but as a potential false emergency claim. That review didn't come from me. It came from the agencies she tried to pressure. I didn't realize what that letter would set in motion. Because once her credibility cracked, everything else followed. Fines were frozen. Enforcement actions were suspended. The board distanced itself from her decisions almost overnight. People who had been silent for months suddenly asked questions. And she was left alone with the consequences of decisions she couldn't undo. The climax wasn't loud. It was procedural, documented, inevitable. And as I sat there, reviewing the final notice that confirmed the HOA had overstepped its authority in ways that couldn't be corrected quietly, I understood something clearly for the first time. This was no longer about my property. It was about what happens when someone mistakes control for power and forgets that records don't forget. Because the fallout hadn't even begun yet. What followed didn't explode all at once. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, the way consequences usually do when everything has already been documented. In the days after the incident, the HOA went quiet. Not the calm kind of quiet, but the kind that happens when people realize every email, every vote, every decision is about to be read by someone outside their circle. Notices stopped appearing on my gate. The online portal froze. Fines that had piled up for months suddenly showed as under review. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like confirmation. Because when an organization that aggressive suddenly retreats, it means the damage is no longer theoretical. The first official resolution came from the authorities, not the HOA. I received written confirmation that there had been no violation, no danger, and no justification for the emergency response. The call was formally classified as unfounded. That document mattered more than any apology could have. It took weeks for the HOA to acknowledge it. When they finally did, it wasn't loud. There was no admission of wrongdoing. Just a brief notice stating that all enforcement actions related to the reported incident have been withdrawn. No explanation. No names attached. But the impact was immediate. Every fine tied to the accusation was erased. Every warning voided. My record, which had been deliberately made to look suspicious, was cleared in one administrative sweep. The very paper trail they tried to use against me became proof that they had overreached. The HOA president didn't resign right away. She stayed quiet, missed meetings, delegated decisions, avoided cameras. That silence didn't protect her. Because once the records requests were fulfilled, The pattern was undeniable. Emails showed escalation without verification. Meeting minutes referenced acting first, confirming later. Internal messages revealed she had been warned, more than once, to slow down. She ignored those warnings. The board couldn't. Within a month, the HOA's attorney advised them to distance the association from her actions. Authority she once exercised freely was revoked in careful, legal language. Committees were restructured. Emergency powers were rewritten. And then, quietly, she was removed from her position. No announcement. No vote posted publicly. Just an update to the directory that replaced her name with interim president. People noticed anyway. They always do. The community changed after that. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact started speaking again. A few apologized without saying what they were apologizing for. Others asked questions, cautious ones, about what had really happened. I answered calmly, never emotionally. I didn't need to exaggerate. The facts carried enough weight on their own. Some neighbors didn't change at all. Suspicion doesn't vanish just because truth shows up late. But the difference was this: they no longer had an institution backing their fear. The HOA learned that lesson the hard way. Insurance premiums went up. Legal reserves were drained. Policies that had once been vague and flexible were rewritten with exhausting precision. The board stopped improvising. Every action now required verification, documentation, and outside review. Control had been replaced with caution. As for me, my standing was never just restored, it was clarified. Agencies reaffirmed my compliance. Inspectors scheduled follow-ups that felt more like courtesy than scrutiny. The same system that had been weaponized against me now acted as my shield. It took months to fully settle, but the lesson was clear. Power without understanding doesn't just fail, it exposes itself. What stayed with me wasn't the sirens or the accusations. It was how easily authority can turn ordinary fear into official action. How quickly concern becomes control when no one pauses to verify. The HOA thought they were protecting the neighborhood. What they were really protecting was their sense of dominance, and when that dominance was challenged by facts, they panicked. I didn't celebrate when it ended. There was no victory lap. Just a quiet return to routine. Feedings. Inspections. Paperwork. The same calm life I'd had before, now reinforced by experience instead of assumption. But the neighborhood never fully went back to normal. Meetings are tense now. Votes are cautious. People ask for proof instead of permission. The board hesitates before acting, aware that someone might be documenting the process the same way I did. What seemed like the end was really just the beginning of a different kind of community, one shaped by restraint instead of impulse. And sometimes, when I walk past the gate where the notice once hung, I think about how small the trigger was. One assumption. One phone call. One person deciding they didn't need to confirm the truth. Because if this could happen over something so easily verified, what else gets enforced without evidence? That's the question I still haven't answered. And maybe that's the point.